There is a version of the seven seals you were taught, and then there is the version that was buried, not erased, because truth has a way of surviving, but hidden, fragmented, scattered across forbidden texts, rejected gospels, and ideas that never made it into the official canon. Because if you understood what the seven seals really represent, you wouldn't fear the end of the world. You would start questioning the one you're already living in. The traditional interpretation, especially in mainstream Christianity, presents the seven seals from the Book of Revelation as a sequence of catastrophic events: war, famine, death, cosmic collapse, and final judgment. It's a timeline of destruction, meant to be taken literally, a divine script of how the world ends. But that interpretation assumes something very specific, that the text is predictive history. Gnostic perspectives challenge that entirely. They ask a different question: what if Revelation isn't about the future, but about perception? In Gnostic thought, the world is not what it appears to be. Reality itself is layered, manipulated, and partially obscured. The material world is often seen not as the ultimate creation of a perfect divine source, but as a flawed construct, sometimes even a prison, governed by lesser forces, often referred to as archons. In that context, the seven seals are not locks on history, but locks on consciousness. Instead of viewing the seven seals as a sequence of external, catastrophic events imposed upon humanity from some distant divine force, a more introspective and psychologically grounded interpretation begins to emerge, one that reframes them as internal thresholds rather than external judgments. In this perspective, the seals are not opened in the sky or in some prophetic future timeline, but within the human mind and consciousness itself. Each seal becomes a barrier, subtle yet powerful, constructed from illusion, fear, conditioning, and inherited belief systems that quietly dictate how individuals perceive reality. These barriers are not immediately visible, which is precisely what gives them their power. They are absorbed over time, normalized through culture, reinforced through institutions, and rarely questioned deeply enough to be dismantled. Within many ancient mystery traditions, particularly those aligned with esoteric and Gnostic thought, enlightenment is not something granted by an external authority, nor is it achieved through passive belief. It is something uncovered, revealed layer by layer through a process of internal confrontation and awareness. Each seal, then, represents a level of perception that must be broken, not by force, but through recognition. And with each layer removed, what is revealed is not a new truth imposed from outside, but a clearer version of what was always there, hidden beneath conditioning. In this sense, the seals are less about the end of the world and more about the end of illusion. The first seal, often depicted through the symbolic image of a white horse and its conquering rider, has traditionally been interpreted as victory, expansion, or divine conquest. But when examined through a more critical, Gnostic lens, that image begins to shift in meaning. The conquest is no longer something noble or righteous. It becomes something far more subtle and unsettling. It represents the illusion of control. The systems that surround individuals, political structures, societal expectations, cultural norms, ideological frameworks, create the convincing impression of freedom while quietly guiding thought, behavior, and perception within invisible boundaries. This is not a conquest enforced through obvious force, but through influence, repetition, and psychological conditioning. People begin to adopt beliefs they did not consciously choose, defend systems they did not create, and live within identities that were, in many ways, assigned rather than discovered. The white horse, in this interpretation, is not purity, it is disguise. It is the appearance of legitimacy, authority, and truth that masks underlying manipulation. And the rider is not an external invader, it is the unseen force of conditioning itself. The moment this seal breaks is not dramatic in a physical sense, but it is deeply disruptive internally. It is the realization that what you thought was your own thinking may have been shaped all along. It is the unsettling awareness that you are not fully in control, but influenced in ways you never questioned. It is not about a rider arriving, it is about recognizing that, for a long time, something else has been riding you. The second seal introduces the red horse, a symbol traditionally associated with war, bloodshed, and conflict. But when expanded beyond the literal interpretation of physical violence, the meaning becomes far more pervasive and psychologically relevant. War, in its deepest sense, is not limited to battlefields or weapons, it is division. It is the fragmentation of unity into opposing sides, the creation of us versus them, the constant reinforcement of separation across every layer of human interaction. This division manifests everywhere, within politics, religion, identity, ideology, and even personal relationships. It shapes how people see each other, how they categorize one another, and how easily they can be turned against one another. Gnostic perspectives often suggest that this fragmentation is not accidental, but engineered. Division becomes a tool of control, because a divided population is easier to influence, easier to direct, and far less likely to unify in awareness. The red horse, then, is not just a symbol of external war, it represents the internalization of conflict. The way individuals are conditioned to see difference as threat, disagreement as opposition, and complexity as something that must be simplified into sides. When this seal is broken, it reveals how deeply division has been embedded into perception itself. And it raises an uncomfortable question: how much of what we call conflict is actually constructed? The third seal brings forth the black horse, carrying scales traditionally linked to famine, scarcity, and imbalance. But famine, when understood symbolically, extends far beyond the absence of food. It becomes a representation of scarcity in its most pervasive form, the scarcity of truth, of clarity, of unfiltered knowledge. Throughout history, access to information has rarely been equal. Knowledge has often been controlled, filtered through institutions, and shaped in ways that serve specific narratives. What people are allowed to know, and perhaps more importantly, what they are not encouraged to question, plays a critical role in maintaining existing systems of power. Information can be withheld, distorted, or overwhelmed with noise, making it difficult to distinguish truth from illusion. In this sense, the famine is intellectual. It is a hunger not of the body, but of the mind, a lack of genuine understanding in a world saturated with information. The scales carried by the rider suggest measurement, control, and distribution. Not everyone receives the same access, the same perspective, or the same opportunity to understand reality beyond surface-level narratives. And over time, this imbalance becomes normalized. When this seal begins to break, it is often accompanied by a growing awareness that what has been presented as truth may be incomplete, manipulated, or selectively framed. The realization is not just that knowledge is limited, but that the limitation itself may be intentional. The fourth seal reveals the pale horse, death, but this is not merely the end of physical life. It is something far more subtle, and in many ways more pervasive. It is the state of spiritual numbness, a condition in which individuals continue to function, moving through routines, fulfilling roles, maintaining appearances, while remaining disconnected from deeper awareness or questioning. In many Gnostic teachings, this condition is described as being asleep within the material world. Not asleep in a literal sense, but in a state of unawareness. Life becomes mechanical, patterns repeat, questions are avoided, and over time a kind of internal silence takes hold, not the silence of peace but the silence of disengagement. People exist, but they do not fully examine the nature of their existence. This form of death is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is reinforced by comfort, by routine, and by the subtle pressure to conform rather than explore. And because it is so normalized, it often goes unnoticed. The breaking of this seal is not easy because it requires confronting the possibility that one has been living without truly seeing. It is the moment when numbness begins to fade and awareness, however uncomfortable, begins to return. The fifth seal introduces a powerful image, voices crying out for justice. Traditionally interpreted as the souls of martyrs, this imagery can also be understood symbolically as the echo of suppressed truth. Throughout history, there have been individuals, philosophers, mystics, thinkers, and questioners who challenged dominant narratives and paid the price for doing so. Their ideas were dismissed, their voices silenced, and in some cases, their existence erased from collective memory. Yet truth has a way of persisting, even when suppressed. It lingers, it reappears, it finds new voices, new forms, and new pathways into awareness. The cry described in this seal is not just a plea for justice, it is the resonance of ideas that refused to disappear. It is the reminder that questioning has always existed, even when discouraged or punished. From a symbolic standpoint, this seal represents the tension between control and expression, the ongoing effort to contain ideas that challenge established systems. When this seal is broken, it often manifests as a resurgence of curiosity, a willingness to explore perspectives that were previously dismissed, and a recognition that not all truths are equally accepted or allowed to surface. The sixth seal is perhaps the most visually dramatic: earthquakes, darkened skies, falling stars. On the surface, it appears apocalyptic, signaling destruction and chaos on a massive scale. But symbolically, it represents something deeply internal: the collapse of perception. The structures that once felt stable, belief systems, identities, assumptions about reality, begin to shift, crack, and in some cases completely fall apart. This is not an easy experience. It is disorienting, unsettling, and often overwhelming. What once felt certain no longer holds the same weight. Questions multiply, clarity becomes elusive, and there is a sense that the ground beneath one's understanding is no longer stable. But this disruption is not necessarily destructive. It can also be transformative. The darkening and falling described in this seal can be seen as the dismantling of illusions, the gradual fading of narratives that once defined reality. It is not the world that is ending, but the interpretation of it. And while that process can feel chaotic, it also creates space for something new to emerge, something less filtered, less imposed, and more directly experienced. And then comes the seventh seal, not with noise, not with destruction, but with silence. After the intensity of the previous revelations, this silence is striking. It is not empty, it is full, but in a way that is difficult to describe. In many interpretations, this moment is overlooked because it lacks the drama of what came before. But symbolically, it may be the most significant of all. In a Gnostic context, this silence is not the end, it is the threshold. The pause that follows the dismantling of illusion. The moment when the noise of conditioned thought, external influence, and inherited belief temporarily falls away. What remains is not a fully formed answer, but something more raw, direct awareness, unfiltered and unfamiliar. This silence can feel uncomfortable at first because it lacks the structures that once provided certainty. But it also offers something rare, the opportunity to perceive without distortion, not truth imposed from outside, not beliefs inherited without question, but awareness that arises from within. And in that silence, there is no longer anything left to break, only something to understand. So why isn't this perspective widely taught? Because it shifts authority. If the seven seals are external events controlled by divine will, then interpretation belongs to institutions. But if they are internal processes, psychological, philosophical, even existential, then authority shifts to the individual. And historically, systems built on structure and control rarely encourage interpretations that decentralize power. Early Christian history wasn't unified. There were competing interpretations, texts, and philosophies. Gnostic writings, like those found in the Nag Hammadi library, offered radically different views of creation, divinity, and human purpose. Many of these texts were excluded from the canon, not necessarily because they were false, but because they didn't align with emerging orthodoxy. Now, let's be clear, there is no single, universally accepted proof that this interpretation is correct, but there is evidence of alternative frameworks, ancient manuscripts, philosophical parallels, repeating symbolic patterns across cultures. When different civilizations independently describe reality as layered, illusory, or partially hidden, it raises a question worth considering. Modern psychology also echoes aspects of this interpretation. Concepts like cognitive bias, social conditioning, and perception shaping show that reality is not experienced objectively. What people see, believe, and accept is influenced by internal filters, many of which operate unconsciously. In that sense, breaking seals could be understood as becoming aware of those filters. Traditional interpretations of the seven seals often emphasize fear of judgment, punishment, and the unknown. Fear can be a powerful motivator, but it can also limit exploration. If a narrative keeps people focused on external catastrophe, it may prevent them from examining internal structure. This perspective is not about rejecting religion entirely. It's about recognizing that texts can operate on multiple levels: literal, symbolic, psychological, and philosophical. The issue arises when one interpretation is presented as the only valid one, especially when alternatives exist. If the seven seals are internal, then the apocalypse becomes personal. Not an event that happens to the world, but a shift that happens within a person. And that shift can be unsettling because it often involves letting go of certainty. Control of narrative has always been one of the most powerful forms of influence. Whoever defines meaning defines reality for others. The reinterpretation of the seven seals challenges that control, not by replacing one authority with another, but by encouraging direct examination. But awareness comes at a cost. It can isolate. It can disrupt relationships, beliefs, and identity. That's one reason why symbolic interpretations like this are often avoided or dismissed. They require engagement, not just acceptance. So the question isn't whether the seven seals predict the end of the world. The question is this: What if they describe the process of seeing it clearly for the first time? And if that's true, then the real opening isn't happening somewhere in the sky. It's happening quietly, in the moment someone begins to question everything they were told was unquestionable. And once that process begins, there is no closing it again.